In this tutorial, we're going to be learning how we can use Formik and Material UI to create better forms in React. To get started, you're going to need to install a few npm dependencies in your project to follow this tutorial. That includes Material UI, Formik, and Yup. Yup is a lightweight validation library we're going to be using with Formik to validate our form fields. Now you can either install these yourself manually, or you can come over to your command line and just copy in this command. Now I've already installed that in the application we're going to be working on, so I don't need to do this, but make sure that you do before we get started. Let's take a look at the application we'll be working on in this tutorial. So at the moment I just have my header and this main content section, which is where we're going to be building a booking form. And if we come over to VS Code, I am just using Create React App, but I've already installed Material UI and created a simple page layout. This is where I have my container, and this is just centering my content. So this is just a great place for us to start the tutorial because we can jump right into using Formik. The first thing that we need to do is initialize Formik on the page. To do that, we need to import two components from the library itself, which is going to be Formik and Form. So we'll import from Formik. We need to import, of course, Formik and the form component. Once we have those, we'll just render them wherever we want the form to render on the page. So for me, I'm going to render them here. So I'm going to render Formik, and then within that, I'm going to render my form. Now, once I've done that, I'm ready to define my initial form state. I'm going to do that above my function. So here, I'm just going to write out a const. So we're storing this in a variable. We're going to call this our initial form state. And at the moment, this is just going to be an empty object. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass this to Formik using the initial values prop. And I'm going to pass that using the spread operator. So this is where we're going to store our initial form state, but again, we're going to come back to this later on in the tutorial. Because the next thing that we want to think about is our validation, our form validation schema. And to do that, we're going to be using the validation library I told you about at the start of the tutorial, which is Yup. To import that, we need to import everything as Yup from Yup. And once we've imported it, we can create our validation schema. So I'm just going to call this my form validation. And then this is going to equal Yup, which is that validation library. We're going to call object, which is a method. And then we're going to define the shape, which is basically the schema of our validation. Again, we're going to come back to this later in the tutorial. For now, this is fine. We're going to take that. And we need to remember to pass this to Formik using the validation schema prop. Okay, so I'll just pass that in here. And then finally, before we continue, we need to handle our onSubmit event. So this is another prop that we're going to pass in a function to. So we'll do that here. Now, when we submit our form using Formik, we're going to get the values that is stored in our form state. And for now, I'm just going to log these out to the console. So I'll just log those values here. I'm going to be using the grid from Material UI to create my form layout. I'm going to have some form fields that sit side by side and others that are full width. Now, the way that it works is we have a grid component, and depending on what props I pass this, will determine our layout. Now, because this is a nested grid, I need to pass the container prop. I'm also going to set the spacing of 2, which is going to nicely space out our form components. We're also going to have grid items. So I'll create a grid item by, again, using the grid component and then passing the item prop. The next thing that's important to understand is that this is a 12-column grid. And the grid has various different breakpoints. The smallest one is extra small. So because this is a 12-column grid and I want this to be a full width item, I need to use all of the 12 columns here. Now we're going to have groups of form components for the user's details, their address, and their booking information. Again, we're creating a booking form. So to create titles for each of those sections, I'm going to be using the typography component from Material UI. So within these full width components, the first one here, I'm going to use the typography component, and I'm just going to add some text in here for your details, and then I'm going to duplicate this 2 more times. And again, this one is going to be for the address fields, and then finally for the booking information, right? So now if we look at this on the front end, you'll see that we just have these 3 sections, and below each one of these titles, we're going to have different form components. The first form component from Material UI that we're going to be working with is the TextField component, and I'm going to be using the outline variant. Now to integrate this with Formik, I'm going to abstract it into its own component that will make it more reusable, and we'll be able to use it throughout the application. So let's create our first form component. So within my components folder, I'll create a new file. I'm going to store these form components in a folder called Forms UI, and this is going to be for my text field, but we're going to need to create index.js. The first thing that we need to do is import React from React, and we need to import the TextField component from Material UI. We're going to get that from Material UI core, and we want the TextField component. Then we just need to create our function. I'm going to call this my TextField wrapper. It's just going to have a function here. We're going to return the TextField component from Material UI, and then all we need to do is add our default export at the bottom of the file for our TextField wrapper and a line break at the bottom of the file. Now this is actually enough for us to successfully render the component on the page, but I want to add a few things. So the first thing is we need to add some default config for this component from Material UI. So I'm going to store that in config text field. It's going to be an object. We're going to set full width to true, and I'm going to set the variant, which is the appearance, to be the outlined variant, which is my preference. And I'm just going to pass this into the component. Now the next thing that we need to think about is how we can make Formik aware of this component. So any changes that are made in this field will update our form state. To do that, we need to use a hook from Formik. So we're going to import something from Formik, which is the use field hook. And to use this, all we have to do is we need to destructure some props that are passed into the component. That would be the name prop, and then we're just going to get any other props that are passed into the component. And I'm also going to use a spread operator to pass in those other props to the text field component. But what we need to do at the top of the function is we need to use the use field hook here. But what we need to pass to this hook is the name. This is the name of the field within our form state, and that's going to be a prop that we have to pass to the component. This is going to allow us to destructure the field and metadata from Formik. And then what we'll do is we'll get the field data, and we'll use again the spread operator to pass that into the text field component. Now the next thing that we need to handle is our error state and error validation. So you'll notice here that we also get back metadata from the use field hook. Now this contains 2 very important properties, which is going to be the touched and error state. Now if either of those are true, then it means that we need to pass the error message to our text field component. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an if statement here, and what we're going to check is that if the meta object contains meta.touched and the meta.error, then what we want to do is we want to take our config variable here, we want to add on the error, we want to set that to true, and we also want to take it and add on the helper text, and again this is just going to equal the meta.error. So what this is going to do is it's going to pass two additional props to the text field component. The first is error, which expects a Boolean value of either true or false. And that is basically going to enable the error state. So the text field will appear red if there is an error. And the other one is the helper text. And this is where we are able to define a custom error message within our yup validation. I'm going to show you that in just a second. And this is where we're able to then pass that into our text field component, and the component will actually render our custom error message, which is stored on our metadata object we're getting back from useField and from Formik. Okay, so that's actually all we need to do to create this component. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back over to app.js. The first thing we need to do is import our text field component. So I'm going to import text field from the components folder. So that's in Forms UI text field. But before I can actually render that out, we need to create our form state for those initial fields at least. So to do that, I'm going to have one field, as I said, for first name, which by default is an empty string. We need another for last name, again, an empty string. We need email, we need phone, and I'm going to come back to the address fields. Then we want to handle our validation. So again, we're using yup here. We need to use the same values we've used in our initial form state, right? Because it needs to map to the same key. So here we'll say we need to define our validation for our first name. So we'll say first name. We're going to say, first of all, we're going to specify that this should be a string of type string. And then what we can do is we can chain on additional validation using the methods available from yup. So for first and last name, at least, we only want to chain on that this is a required field. And we can pass in a custom error message. For me, I'm just going to say that this is a required field. We need to do the same thing for the last name. So again, first of all, we say that it should be a string. I need to remember here to add a comma. And then I need to chain on that, again, this is a required field with a custom error message of required. It could actually be anything. And then email. So our email and phone validation are going to be a little bit different to these two fields because they're going to have additional validation. So first of all, let's target the email. So for our email, again, we want to specify that it should be of type string, but we're going to chain on an additional method, which is email. We can pass in another custom error message here, which is going to be invalid email. And again, this should be a required field with a custom error message of required. And again, I just want to note here, you should only add a comma after the final method that you're chaining on here, right? So this could all be on a single line. You only add the comma at the end. It's only that I'm putting this on separate lines that I'm adding it like this. And then finally, we have our phone validation. And again, this is going to be different to the others. So unlike the others, which was of type string, this is going to be of type number. And then we're going to chain on that it should be an integer, and we need to pass a type error, which is where we pass in our custom error message. And I'm just going to say, please enter a valid phone number. And also this should be a required field. So again, I'm just going to have the simple required error message. So that's really all the validation for the fields we've defined so far. We are going to have to add more. But the next thing that we need to do is actually just render our text field component that we've imported here and we created earlier in the tutorial. So let's come down, and the first group of form fields are going to be under your details. So again, we're going to have these fields for first name, last name, email and phone. So because of all the logic here being taken care of in this reusable component, it's going to be really easy to use now throughout the application, almost effortless. So the first two fields are first and last name. I want them to sit side by side. So I need to create another two grid items, and I'm going to pass to the extra small prop 6. So by doing that, what that means is that this particular item is going to use 6 of the 12 columns. So if I pass 2 items that are both using 6 columns, I'm going to have a 2-column row, which is what I want. And then I'm going to use that TextField component, right? And what I'm going to pass is these 2 important props. The first is name, and the name is the most important prop because this is how we link the component to our Formik form state. So for first name, it needs to exactly match the key we've used in our form state and validation schema. So for the first field, it is first name. And then for the second field, which I'm just going to copy and paste to save time, is going to be last name. Now, because in our TextField wrapper, we are allowing the user to pass in other props, and we're passing that to the Material UI TextField component, we can just pass in any other props based on Material UI components that we want to pass in. So I'm going to pass in the label, right, for both first and last name. And for each one, I'm just going to say that this is going to be first name and last name. So let's save that and come back over to the browser and just see how this looks. So as you can see, that looks pretty nice. We have our 2 form fields. If I click in without entering a value, I get the error. If I enter a name here, so Joe blogs, you'll see that it matches the validation, so it passes. So that looks pretty good. Now let's add in the other fields for email and phone. Let's come back over to VS Code. And these are going to be pretty much the same thing, but I'm going to just duplicate this twice for email and phone. So for the name, it needs to be email, and the label will be email. And again, for phone, we'll say phone and phone. But I want these to be 2 full width columns. So I'm going to pass 12 here and here. So when I come back over to the browser, you'll see I now have the layout that I want. And again, the validation. If I entered just a string of characters, it's not a valid email. If I enter a valid email, so test@email.com, it passes. Likewise with phone. If I enter text, it's not a valid number. If I enter a number, etc., it passes. So that's working, which is fantastic. Let's come back over to the browser. And as I said, the next thing that I want to do is work on the address fields. So let's come back over to VS Code and come up to my form state. And what we want is address first of all. So we're going to have address line 1, again, empty string, address line 2, an empty string. We're going to have city, state, and country, which is also going to be an empty string. And then we need to actually pass in those fields to our form validation schema. So for address line 1, it should be type string. And we're going to chain on that this is a required field. And then for address line 2, now this is not going to be a required field, but we're going to say that, yup, it should be type string. But we're not going to specify that this is a required field. And then we have city and state. So for city, it again should be of type string, and this is going to be a required field. So we'll say the label is required, and then for state we will say again it should be of type string, and we'll chain on that again it is a required field. And then finally for country, again type string, but we chain on that it is a required field. Okay, we're now ready to actually add in the form fields. So let's come back down, and underneath address I'm going to duplicate this form field again. So let's duplicate that. Notice here I'm passing 12. So again, this needs to match the exact keys we've got in our form state. So address line 1, etc. So let's come down. So again, we have the name, which is going to be address line 1. In the label, address line 1. Let's duplicate this field. So this is now address line 2. And then we have city and state. Now I'm going to duplicate this twice because again I want these to sit side by side. So I'll change the values to 6. So this is going to be for city, and this one is going to be for state. Let's save that. Now I'm going to create a placeholder for country, because actually we're not going to use the text field component. We are going to use a new select component that we're going to create in just a second. But for now, let's come back over to the browser and let's just reload. And you can see we now have the new address fields. And again, the validation works as expected. Again, this is a optional field. So state is not showing the validation. Let's just check why. So again, this is a great example. So for the name on state, it is case sensitive. So if I check the form state here, it is a lowercase s, whereas the label here, obviously it doesn't matter. So it's very important that this is case sensitive. It must match the keys in our form state. Let's come back over to the browser, reload, and as you can see now we're getting the correct validation. Now we're going to be using the select component from Material UI for our country dropdown. So let's go ahead and come back over to VS Code, and within my Forms UI folder I'm going to create a new file. So I'm going to call this my select, and we're going to have index.js inside of that folder. And the first thing that we want to do is import React from React, and then we want to import two components from Material UI. We're going to get that from, again, Material UI core. So the first one is actually going to be TextField, and the second one is going to be menu item. And then we just need to create our function. I'm going to call this my select wrapper. It's just going to be a function. It's just going to be a function. So for now, we're just going to return the text field, and we need to add our default export at the bottom of the file, so our select wrapper, and add a default line break. The first thing that we need to define is our custom config that we'll be passing to our text field component. So I'm going to create a config for our select here. And the most important thing is that we want to set select to true. That's because obviously this is going to be a select component. The next is the variant that we're going to be using. Again, this is kind of objective and up to you. But again, we're using the outlined variant. And then finally, we want to make sure that this is the full width version of the component. So again, we need to set that to true. But then we want to make sure we are passing that to the component itself. Now, the next thing that we need to handle is the onChange event. Now, unfortunately, because unlike a text field where when the user inputs their name, and Formik would automatically update the form state, the select is not going to behave that way. We're going to have to manually handle the onChange event. So we're going to pass in the onChange event here. And we're going to create a custom handle change function, which is going to receive an event. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but make sure we pass that to onChange. And the reason that we need a custom onChange event is because the event is going to return a large object, and we need to actually destructure the value off of that from the target that will allow us to actually handle that and update our form state within Formik. So to actually do that, we need to import something from Formik itself, which is a new hook. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll import from Formik. We actually need the use field hook, but we also need the use Formik context hook. So the prop set we are going to pass into the component, again, is going to be important. We need the name prop. We'll also get the other props here, but we're also going to get options. We need to pass in some custom options here. So at the top of this function, the first thing that we need to do is we need to destructure two things from the use field hook, which is going to take the name. So that again is going to be the field and the meta data. Again, we can use the spread operator here to pass in the field data into the component. But what we'll also do is we're going to call the use Formik context hook, and this will give us back the set field value function. And this is the function that we're going to use to update the form state from within our component. We're going to do that manually. So to do that, first of all, on the onChange event, we need to actually get the option that the user has selected. To do that, we're going to destructure from the event.target, we're going to get the value. Once we have that, we already know what this particular form state is because we have the name. So we can call set field value, we'll give it the name, and then we'll give it the value, and that will update the Formik state. So the next thing that we need to handle is going to be actually rendering our options. So the options are going to be passed in as an object. Now, what I can actually show you is that I have got a list of countries stored in a JSON file within my project. Now, each of these has a key, which is an abbreviation of the country, and then it has the full name of the country. Now, we're not going to tie this select field to my list of countries, but of course, within my form, I'm going to be using this select field to actually add a drop-down list of countries. Now, I'll share this with you in a gist or maybe some other public repository. I'll link to it in the description of this video. But again, this is just a list of countries we'll be using in this tutorial for our select drop-down for our countries. So let's come back over. Now, this is going to be passed in as an object. Now, of course, you cannot map an object. So to do that, what we'll do is for our text field, we're actually going to pass in and render children. And what we want to do is we want to call some ES6 syntax. We'll say object.keys, and we're going to pass in our options. That will give us an array we can map. I'm going to get the item. We're going to get the item and the position. And then this is where we will do an explicit return, and we're going to render the menu item that we are also importing at the top from Material UI. So we're going to render a menu item here, and the key is going to be the position. The value is going to be the item. And then to actually render the country name, we're going to render the option with the item, right? So that is going to give us our, that's going to render our countries, okay? So then finally, all we have to do at this point is handle our error validation, right? So again, all we have to do is down here, we're going to have an if statement where we check the metadata, and we want to check the touched event is true, and we want to check if the error is true. If it is, we're going to get our select config. We're going to set the error to true. And we're going to set the helper text to the meta.error message that we defined in our yup validation. And then finally, we're going to get those other props, use a spread operator, and pass that into the component as well. Okay, so we're now ready to actually use our new select component within our app.js. So at the top of the file, let's import those two things. The first thing we need to import is, of course, our select component. We'll import that from our components folder. So that's in Forms UI and select. And then finally, we need to import our countries list, which for me is in data countries.json. And again, I'll be sharing a link to this in a gist or something in the description of the video. So to render this within our form, I'm going to come down and I'm going to render the select component. And we need to pass in the name. And of course that needs to match our form state. So up here you'll see we have country. So again, the name here is going to be country. We need to pass a label, which again is going to be country. And we need our options, which is going to be our JSON countries, which I've imported again at the top of the file. So let's now come back into the browser and view this. Let's now come back over to the browser and let's see how this looks. So as you can see, I have all my current fields. If I go ahead and select country, I have my countries drop down. I can select a country and you'll see that it updates accordingly. Also, if I reload this, you'll see the validation. So if I select something and I click out without actually selecting a country, it throws an error, which is correct. That's our validation working. So as you can see, this is working. Okay, the next component we're going to be looking at is the date and time picker. We're going to be using this for our arrival and departure dates that we want to incorporate into our booking form under booking information. So let's come back over to VS Code and we're going to create those new components. Let's close these other ones. So within my components folder and within Forms UI, I'm going to create another new file. We're going to put this inside of date time picker. Then there's going to be index.js. And then all we need to do at the top of this file, we need to import React from React. We need to import the the component from Material UI core, which is it's the TextField component. And then we just need to create our function. So we'll say const date time picker. We'll have an explicit return here, and we're just going to render for now. We'll render our text field, and we need to remember to do our default export here. So we'll say date time picker with an extra line break at the bottom of the file. So just like before, we're going to create our config here. So we'll say const config date time picker. And the most important one here, the most important prop we're going to pass is the type. So the type here is going to be of type date. Again, we want to set the variant and again, I'm using the outline variant. We want to set the full width prop to true, but we also want to set the input label props, and we want to set shrink to true. And this is just something that you have to do with the date and time pickers around the labels that we'll be passing into the component. And then finally, we'll just need to pass this into our TextField component. Okay, so we now need to look and think about the props we'll be passing into the component again. So again, we need the name, and we need to get any other props that are passed into the component. We're going to need to make Formik aware of this component. So to do that, we need to import from Formik the use field hook. You need that for these custom fields that we create. And then we need to use that at the top of our function. So again, we're going to destructure from calling the use field hook with the name. We're going to get the field and the metadata, and we'll be able to pass that into our config object as well as our other props. And then finally, we just have to handle our error state. So again, it's going to be exactly the same. We're going to have our if statement here. We're going to check that we're going to check the meta object. We're going to check that. We're going to check if it's been touched, and we're going to check the errors. And then if that returns true, we're going to get the config object. We're going to set error to true, and we're going to set the helper text to be the meta.error. Okay, so now all we need to do is come back over to app.js, and again, for our booking information, we want to add the arrival and departure date. So at the top of this file, let's import our date time picker. We want to import that from our components folder, forms UI, date time picker. We need to create our initial form state. So we're going to have our arrival date and our departure date. We'll just set them to be empty strings for now. And then for our validation, again, we're going to have our arrival date, and it is going to be of type yup.date. And we're going to chain on that it is a required field. And we want to do the same thing for our departure date. So again, yup.date. And we're going to chain on that it is another required field. And then all we have to do is come down to where we want to render those components. Let's just duplicate this code here. Right, so we want to render it here. We're going to render our date time picker. And then again, the name needs to match our form state. So we have our arrival date. We need to pass a label, which is again going to be arrival date. Let's duplicate this, and we're going to change this to be departure date, and again departure date for the label. I want these two fields to sit side by side, so again I'm going to change the columns to 6 on both of these. And then let's come back over to the browser. Let's just reload the page, and as you can see, this is now working just fine. So I can actually select the date, and as you can see, this is working perfectly fine. The next thing that I want to do is I want to have a message area. It's going to be a text area that just allows the user to enter a message with their booking form, right? So that's going to be really easy. We don't even need to create a new form component. The first thing I'm going to do is just add some more form state just for message. Again, it's going to be an empty string. This is going to be an optional field, but I am going to have some validation where I just check that it is of type string. Okay, so now that we've defined our form state and validation for message, let's come down, and wherever we want to render this, let's create another grid item. And then within that, we need to render our text field, right? And then we'll just set, again, like normal, let's set our name to be message, a label, which matches, so we'll say message. And then we're going to set 2 additional props that's going to turn this text field into a text area. One which is multi-line, we need to set this to true. And then the second, which is rows, which I'm going to set to 4. You can set that to anything that you like. Once I do that, I'm going to come back over to the browser, and you'll see that I now have a text area within my form that the user can use to add a custom message with their booking. The next component from Material UI we're going to be using is the Checkbox component. Now this is a little bit different because we are going to need to have validation with this. We're going to use this to add a little checkbox at the bottom of our form that just confirms they agree to our terms. But unfortunately, this particular component from Material UI doesn't have an error prop, which means we're going to have to use a form control to actually create a group and show an error message when the validation error is thrown. I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So let's come back over to VS Code, and within, again, my form UI component folder, I'm going to create another folder and file. We're going to call this our checkbox. We'll have index.js inside of that. Okay, so all we need to do here is import React from React. Then we need to import a number of components on this occasion from Material UI core. So the first one will be checkbox, but we're also going to need a form control. We're going to need a form control label. So we'll say form control label. We'll need a form group and a form label. Okay. Now once we've done that, we can just create our basic function. So I'll say checkbox wrapper. It's going to equal a function. We'll have our return. And what we need to return is our form control. We will have our form label, which we'll come back to. We're going to have our form group. And within that, we're going to have our form control label, which is where we will render our control, which on this occasion is actually our checkbox component. And we're also going to render a label here, which we're going to get from our props. So our props, in our props, we're going to destructure the name. We're going to destructure the label. We're going to destructure a legend. And then we'll just get any other props that are passed into the component. So again, for our label, we're going to pass in the label. We also need to create our configuration object. So we'll say const config checkbox. And what we want to pass in here is actually going to be 2 things. The first is going to be our field. So again, we need to import something from Formik, which is the use field hook. We'll then be able to use that at the top of our function. So here we're going to call use field and pass in name. That will give us, again, that will give us our field and meta. We'll then be able to pass field into our config object, but we also need a custom on change event. So of course that means we'll need a custom handle change event. So we'll say const handle change. Again, it's going to take an event. We'll come back to, and we'll pass that in here, and we will pass that to our checkbox component as well. And then as we have a custom handle change, we'll need the use Formik context hook, which we'll need to use at the top of our function. So again, we'll call that here. We need to get our set field value. And of course here, we need to destructure from the event.target. We need to destructure checked, and then we will call set field value with the name and checked. So that's either going to be true or false, as checked will be a Boolean value. And then for our form label, we're going to be using our legend. So again, the component is going to be legend, and we're going to render that there as well. And then finally, to handle the error is actually going to be a little bit different on this occasion. So we actually need to pass the error into our form control, because as I said before, Checkbox actually doesn't have a prop on that for error. So what we'll do is we're going to say const config form control equals an empty object actually, and then we'll have our if statement, which is going to be more or less the same but a little bit simpler. So we're going to have meta, and then we're going to check again the normal. So if touched is true, and if meta dot error is true, then we're going to grab our config form control and set error equals to true, and then we'll pass that into our form control. Now the last thing that we have to do is just export this. So I'll add in some semicolons, export default checkbox wrapper, add a line break at the bottom of the file, and then we can save that and come back over to app.js, and we will import that component. So we'll import our checkbox from our components folder, forms UI, checkbox. And then in our initial form state, I'm going to have terms of service, and I'm going to set that by default to false. And then for my validation, again, I'm going to target the terms of service, but on this occasion, I'm going to validate that it should be of type Boolean. And the way that we can chain on events to validate this is that it should be one of an array which is true, which is the only valid, which is the only thing that we want, that we will accept as valid. And then I'm going to pass in a custom error message, which just says the terms must be accepted. And then I'm also going to say that it is required. And again, I'm going to have another custom message, which is the same message here. And I'm just going to make this single quotes. And that's it. So what I can now do is then come down to wherever I want to render the checkbox. So underneath the message, I'll have another full width grid item, and I'm going to render my checkbox. And again, on this occasion, the name needs to match the form state. So that's going to be terms of service. I'm going to pass in a legend, which is going to be terms of service, and then finally a label, which is just I agree. Let's save that and come back over to the browser. Let's come back over to the application, reload the page, scroll down. You'll see we have our checkbox at the bottom of the file. Now, it's going to be difficult to see the validation, you just saw it there, until we actually have a submit button. So the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to show you how you can add in your submit button. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is create our form submit button. So again, within my forms UI folder, I'm going to create button/index.js. And then all I need to do at the top of this file is just go to import react from React, we need to import the Material UI component. So we'll import that from Material UI core. We want to import the button component. And then obviously, as I've mentioned before, we're going to need something from Formik. So we're going to import the use Formik context hook. And then we just need to create our function. I'm going to call this my button wrapper. This is going to be a fairly straightforward component. We're just going to return the button component from Material UI. Let's just add our default export at the bottom. So we'll just say button wrapper like that. And then what we need to do is we need to get another method from Formik. So at the top of the function, we need to call the use Formik context hook. But this time, what we want to get is submit form. Once we have that, we need to also create a custom handle submit function. So we'll just say const handle submit. And again, this is just going to call submit form, which is this function here. So on our button, what we're actually going to do is we're going to render the button text that is passed into the component. So we'll get that from our props. We'll just say other props here, but we're going to pass in text. There's a few ways of doing this. You could either do it this way, or you could actually do it as children. I think I'm going to do it as children. So what I'll do here is I'll just get I'll destructure the children here. So I'll say children, and then here I'll just render the children. And then the props that we're going to actually pass to the component. So let's create a config here. So we'll say const config button. We'll bind our onClick event. So we'll say on click, and we'll bind handle submit. On this occasion, we want to set the variant to contained and the color to primary, and we're going to set full width to true. Okay, now let's pass our config to our button, and that's actually all we need to do. So what we can do now is just come back over to app.js and import that button. So again, at the top of the file, we're going to import button from our components folder / forms UI button. We're going to come down to the bottom of our form, and underneath our checkbox, we'll create another grid item. This time, we're going to we'll render our button, and we'll just say submit form. All right, so we're now ready to test this. As you will remember, at the start of the tutorial where we initialized Formik, on the submit event, we are just logging the values out to the console. So what I've done, again, is I've just filled out the form, and I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. When I do, if I come over to the console, you'll see that all the values that the users entered into the form have been logged to the console. So we can use this to submit an email to the moderator with all of these, with all of this information. Or if this was a login form, we could use this to sign them in. But this is just a really easy way for us to build forms with Formik, with Material UI, and with React. If you enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see more of my content, then why not subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so as I release new videos, you'll be notified and be able to find them. If you want to access the source code I've written in this tutorial, I'll be sharing that on a GitHub repository I'll be linking to in the description of this video. You can either find it by clicking that, or you can visit my GitHub page, which is github.com/simpletut. You can also find my website, which is simpletut.com. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.